Hello, welcome again to Business Immigration Online. Let's talk a little bit about diplomatic and official visas. We're not going to talk a lot about those because although these are work visas, they are not generally the kind that you would come across very often. In New York and some other places like Washington, D.C., you may likely to see more of these. And in those situations, in the workplace or whatever it's going to be, you're probably more likely going to meet dependents of those visas, spouses and maybe children of the diplomats. So it's important to know those things as well. But um, the diplomat visas themselves are working visas, so we mentioned them here briefly, just so you know. In general, diplomatic visas and visas for UN, NATO, and international organizations like the International Monetary Fund are issued based on international treaties about diplomatic relationship, about UN headquarter agreement, and similar international accords that say what type of visas and with what kind of rights and immunities can be issued by each country. The US, as the host of the UN headquarter, also has agreements with the US concerning the coming and going of the people the UN needs here. So this is the HQ agreement, the headquarter agreement for the UN. And the same goes for certain other international organizations that their headquarters in the United States. The United States agreed to give certain accommodation to people who serve in those organizations. In general, the rules that apply to those visas, they're governed by the international treaties and protocols. It's administered almost exclusively by the State Department, Department of State in Washington, and by the U.S. delegation to the UN when it comes to UN visas for other countries. The U.S. delegation usually handles that. Um, Quite a few of the terms of this visa is determined by reciprocity, especially auxiliary rights like the right to work in other locations and so on are usually based on bilateral agreements between the U.S. and the other country. Um, People with diplomatic visas are not subject to all but the very severe terrorist ground and public safety grounds of inadmissibility. So, in most cases, diplomats will be allowed to proceed into the United States without hindrance. There is no requirement for non-immigrant intent um, to be proven in this. Of course, these are non-immigrant visas, but their duration could be quite long, and some of them will grant you a duration of status admission that we mentioned before with regard to student visa and certain other visas that we mentioned. The special issues that concern this type of visas, which are again something you're more likely to see maybe, um, spouses and dependent may be eligible to work depending on the sub classification. You will see that there are several subtype of the visas, A1, A2, A3. Some of them will allow a dependent to work, some of them will not. Um, the beneficiaries, in general, the primary, the diplomats, might not engage in any other matter. So you won't see, you cannot have someone on a diplomatic visa moonlighting on the weekend in a restaurant. That's not allowed. Um, Spouse and children generally must hold the dependent visa only. Um, in some situation, as is quite possible, if they're a married couple, each one of them can have their own H-1B, for example, or one can have L1, one can have E, it's okay for generally for spouses to have different visas, especially if they both want to work and the visa is of the type that does not allow dependents to work. In most diplomatic visas, this is not allowed. The State Department require that all dependents of the diplomat or the official, will have the same type of visa as the main person, and this is for reasons that they want to make sure that there is compliance with the international treaties, that those people who have immunities will use the immunities and not going to be subject to other situation. This is good and bad. It's bad in a situation where in the dependent visa, especially for spouses, it does not allow for work, and the spouse is not able to get their own independent work visa. So if someone is on A2, for example, then their spouse and dependents will also be on A2. The spouse, right now, as of July of this 2016, is not allowed to work anymore, and therefore cannot do much. They cannot get a different type of visa because they are dependent of someone who is on a diplomatic visa, and they cannot get work authorization that severely limits what they can do. Again, the example of the A2 work authorization. For years there has been a work authorization, and as of July, based on some announcement that the Secretary of State did based on the diplomatic treaties of Vienna that regulates diplomatic relationship, he determines that no longer will spouses of A2 be able to work. More issues. Dependents for this type of visas often include adults, unmarried sons and daughter. If usually dependents stop to be dependent once they reach the age of 21, for many of those diplomatic visas, as long as you're not married, you remain a dependent, even if you are 25, 26, 27. If you're not married and either of your parents has one of these visas, or both of them, then you will not age out of the dependent status. Um, Certain types of diplomatic visas have particular and unique ways to get lawful permanent residence under the special immigrant categories. We're going to talk about this category very briefly later on in the course. But there are provisions that allow career diplomats who were here for years, or diplomats where they were here as high-level diplomats, and all of a sudden there was a coup in their country, and they can no longer go back to their country because now someone else is pulling the reins. There are situations where these people can apply and receive green card very quickly. Um, Servants and domestic employees of diplomats, UN, NATO, all those um, now must have an agreement. And the reason is that there were some very high profile cases of abuse, people who were working for these officials and were locked in their houses without their passports, without the ability to communicate, without any kind of benefits or any kind of human treatment, even in some situation. And the big uproar that came because of that resulted in that now they have to have a contract. Moreover, if they complain of abuse, then they have deferred action, meaning the U.S. will let them stay here even though their visa is no longer in effect, to persecute the matter. So this is very important. One more word. Children of diplomats, um, if the diplomat has immunities and shows up on what's called the blue list of the State Department that can be found on the website, their children will not be citizen by birth, even if they're born in the U.S. Um, so their children will be permanent resident. If they depart the United States when their parents finish their service here, they will be subject to losing their status like any other lawful permanent resident. Children of lower level diplomats and other officials who are not on the blue list would generally be citizen at birth, like anyone else who's born in the United States. So that's important to know. It's one of these rare cases where a birth certificate in the US is not an evidence of citizenship and eligibility to work and do some other things.